Welcome to Never Again Is Now, a podcast about anti Semitism. I am Evelyn Marcus.
And I am Phyllis Zimbler Miller.
The savagery and hatred with which Jews were slaughtered in Israel on October 7th crushed our illusion that this level of Jew hatred no longer exists after the Holocaust. And not only that, Jew hatred exploded around the world after October 7th. Best-selling author, historian and counter-terror analyst Robert Spencer places this in historical context in his new book, Antisemitism, History and Myth. Robert Spencer is the director of Jihad Watch and the Shulman Fellow at the David Horowitz Freedom Center. Welcome back, Robert, to our show. We are so honored to have you on our show again.
The honor is all mine. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The title of your new book is Antisemitism, History and Myth. What is the history of the hatred we saw taking place on October 7th, and what is the myth?
October 7th was all about Islamic anti-Semitism, which is one of the four primary root causes of anti-Semitism that I discuss in the book. Christianity, Islam, National Socialism, and International Socialism. That is Nazism and communism. And on October 7th, what we saw was the logical result of the incitement to violence and hatred that has been preached in Gaza and in the Palestinian Authority for years now against Israel and against Jews in general. That is rooted in the Quran, the holy book of Islam, and the idea that the Jews are the worst enemies of the Muslims, as the Quran says in chapter 5, verse 82, and always scheming to interfere with their plans and to rebel against Allah and so on. And the Quran, people don't realize, is deeply anti-Semitic, deeply hateful. So is Islamic tradition. There's a great deal of confusion and outright misinformation about this point in the West. I debated actually about 20 years ago at UCLA, a professor who's still quite active on the scene, saying that it was the Nazis who brought anti-Semitism into the Islamic world and it didn't exist before that. Nobody who's actually read the Quran and studied Islam could possibly hold to that view, because the Jews are constantly scapegoated in the Islamic tradition. And on October 7th, they expressed the hatred that they've been taught is not only a duty in the religion of Islam, but is something that is positively rewarded by Allah, the Supreme God. And thus they think that as they committed these terrible acts of cruelty, they not only thought they were justified, but thought that they were righteous and going to be rewarded by Allah for the cruelty that they expressed upon the people that they killed, the people that they took hostage, and so on. Then after that, of course, then the left came in and added to it all.
So there is a state of war between Palestinians and Israel going on, but the amount of the level of cruelty and hatred can just not be explained by normal war circumstances, like regular, right? So what you're saying is, the way I understand what you're saying is, the cruelty is kind of an imperative in the Quran. Is that correct?
Yes. We have to remember that when we see the victimhood propaganda of the Palestinian Arabs that charges the IDF with all manner of terrible actions that are fictional, that this is directed not only to the West to try to manipulate public opinion in the West, but it's also designed to remind Palestinian Arabs of a religious obligation that is stated in the Quran in chapter 2, verse 194. Whoever transgresses against you, you transgress in the same way against him. And so imagine if you are somebody who believes that that's the word of the Supreme Being, and you are told in your news outlets and from everyone you trust that the Israelis commit terrible atrocities against Palestinians all the time. And we have to remember that in the wake of October 7th, there were numerous Palestinian spokesmen saying, "We have been suffering on October 7th every day for 75 years. This is what the Israelis do to us on a routine basis." That's not just rhetoric to marshal the forces who worship victimhood in the West, although it is certainly that. It's also designed to say to the Palestinian Arabs, now you have to do this to the Israelis, what we've been claiming they've been doing to us. See, it's just the opposite. In Christianity, it says Jesus says, somebody strikes you on the right cheek, offer him the other also. This is just the opposite. He says, the Quran says, if somebody does something to you, you do the same thing back. And so all this victimhood propaganda is very dangerous because it's inciting directly the Palestinians to commit those atrocities against Israelis.
I just like to, I know this is going to be, I'd like to go back a few hundred years to when Islam started, the 6th century, right?
Seventh,
And,
yeah.
and 7th century, 600 and something. And as I understand it, you can tell me if this is a myth, that Muhammad originally thought that the Jews would come over to his side, and that when they didn't, that's when he unleashed his ferocious anti-Semitism in the Quran, because obviously they weren't based on Jews being Jew killers. So he had to come up with something else. And it's been there ever since. Is that
Yeah, that is
correct?
a widespread view that, and the Quran certainly does appeal to Jews on the basis of saying that the Quran itself is just the confirmation of what's in the Torah, and Muhammad is a prophet in the line of the Jewish prophets. So why can't the Jews accept him? And so they're considered to be deliberately perverse in rejecting the message of the Quran and Muhammad because it's the same as the message. And then, of course, the Jews say, well, it's not the same. And then that leads to the further charge, which is not actually rooted in the Quran, that but is very common among Muslims to this day, that the Jews actually tampered with their scripture to change it so that it would remove the resemblance of it to the Quran, and thus but it in its original form it's the same as the Quran, and the Jews are just being obstinate and perverse in rejecting Muhammad, the Quran, and Islam. And so they have to be punished in this world as well as in the next for that perversity and obstinacy. And that's why the Muslims have the obligation to wage war against them. It's a religious war, and then this is compounded by the fact that the territory that Israel is on was once ruled by Islamic law. And the Quran in chapter 2, verse 191 says, drive them out from where they drove you out. Now, we can talk about 1948, and it's a matter of historical record, although it's not well known, that the Israelis did not actually drive the Arabs out. The Arab Higher Committee told them to leave. But in a larger sense, because the land was once ruled by Islamic law, it's ruled by Islamic law forever, or it should be, and the Muslims have a religious obligation before Allah to drive out the Israelis. So this is fundamentally a religious war that will never admit of a negotiated solution.
I just want to add one thing. The morning after 9/11, I heard Obama, Osama bin Laden's number two or something, say, we will get back Andalusia.
Mhm.
And lots of people might not have paid attention, but that's Spain. And I knew right then, and I wish our listeners would understand, it will not stop with the Israelis. The Muslim, what Robert Spencer just said is very important that we understand. Once it's been ruled by Muslims, it must be regained.
Mhm.
So I think that's very important to understand.
Spain is very high on the list. And if it were ever were to happen, and of course we hope and pray it will not, but if Israel were destroyed, then Spain would suddenly see a massive uptick in jihad activity because they're the next on the list, because they have the same obligation there, drive them out from where they drove you out.
Okay, now let's switch briefly to that's what happened for October 7th. But now what's happening? Why this huge, widespread anti Semitism all over the world?
This is because of the leftist Islamic alliance. And that comes from the fundamental nature of leftism and really of anti Semitism in general. As I show in the book, Anti Semitism, History and Myth, the four major sources of anti Semitism historically Christianity, Islam, National Socialism, International Socialism they all fundamentally are opposed to the Jews because they see them as the quintessential symbol of the other group that does not accept the fundamental beliefs of their group. And so the larger group is wanting to have a collective and have everyone included. And the Jews are saying, no, thank you. We want to maintain our distinct identity. And so this is unacceptable to the adherents of the larger group. And they want to reduce the Jews, like everyone else, to components of their larger group. Now, the quintessential collectivists are not the Christians or the Muslims or even the National Socialists, but the communists, the International Socialists. We can see this even today with the push for diversity, equity, and inclusion. Equity is a very important word. It's not equality. Equality is something that we can all accept as a value to strive for, that we should all have equality of opportunity, that we have the equal chance to do whatever we may choose to do. Equity is not that. Equity is equality of outcome, not equality of opportunity. That is, if you work hard and I sit and watch movies all day, then we still get the same amount of money. If you are intelligent and industrious and I'm stupid and lazy, we still get the same amount of money. Equity is equality of outcome because the idea of equity of collectivist leftism in general is to erase all distinctions between people so that everyone is on absolutely the same level in every way. That's why in Chairman Mao's China they even all wore the same clothes because it's equity. If your clothes are nicer than mine, we're not equal. And so we all have to wear the same ugly little drab uniform. And so in this collectivist imperative, the idea of a state for a particular people that is irreducible and will not join the larger collective is unacceptable. Leftism is thus absolutely inherently contradictory to the very idea of Jews, of Judaism, and of Israel. And I think it's ironic that so many leftists, so many Jews are leftists in the West. I respectfully suggest they have not thought this through. And in any case, on October 7th, the left, with its hatred for Israel that I've just been explaining, joined up with the Islamic jihadis to create an international propaganda movement to manipulate public opinion and portray in the Marxist fashion the Israelis as the oppressors and the Palestinians as the oppressed, to try to manipulate people into standing with the alleged oppressed.
I just have to say this one thing. I will never ever understand how they can the privileged students at universities, etc., can stand there and not think beyond the fact that they will have to give up, or their parents will have to give up their Teslas, their Porsches. I mean, it's beyond my understanding. You're laughing, but I don't understand it.
Well, they're you know when you're a teenager, when you're 20 years old, you can be very idealistic and you can think, well, sure, I grew up with a Tesla, I grew up with a Mercedes, I grew up in a grand house, but what about all the people who didn't? And I'm willing to sacrifice and give up these things so that we can all be equal. And it's portrayed as a noble struggle for a great cause. And that's very appealing to young people.
Until they have to live that way.
Yeah, well, they don't have the life experience or the historical knowledge to know what communism is really like in practice. And so they hear about how wonderful it is from all their professors, and they hear about how the Palestinians are oppressed and the Israelis are the oppressors. And so they think, well, we've got to fight against the oppressor. And they have no idea. They probably never heard of the Gulag. They have never thought it through to realize that you can't have economic equity without force, and that that means that people are going to be tortured and killed so that you can ensure that everybody is on the same economic level. They've never thought about these things, or if they have, they wave it away with something like saying to have make an omelet, you have to break some eggs, and they don't really think about breaking eggs in this case means the blood of your friends and family, or maybe of yourself. And you don't know really until you've lived it, or you've known people who've lived it, or you've studied enough history to know what happened.
How
Yeah,
about
because
two
it
books?
it
Animal
it, it
Farm in 1984. Go ahead, Evelyn.
yeah, because it sounds really attractive, communism, socialism. It really does. It sounds very fair. But
Yes,
history has proven over and over and over again that societies that adopt socialism or communism become the most oppressive of
yes.
all. So unfortunately, it's not working in reality. On the contrary, have there always been different reasons in history for hating Jews, Robert, or is there a common reason? And I think you touched upon it a little bit already, but could you elaborate more on that, please?
Absolutely. You know, I think that the answer is yes to both, that there are particular reasons, but they all come down to a common reason. And I mentioned the common thing that they have together a minute ago, that it's all a matter of larger groups establishing a collective and wanting the Jews and everyone else to join it, and the Jews don't want to join collectives that would involve giving up their particular identity, culture, practices, and beliefs. And so they become the enemy of the people who believe strongly in the collective that was trying to get them to join. But the particular collectives, there are four primary ones that we've seen throughout history that have been the cause of anti-Semitism. You have Christianity that claims that the Christian anti-Semites claim that the Jews killed Jesus and bear particular guilt for killing the Savior of the world, the Messiah, and so on, the Son of God. Now, this is extraordinary in several ways. One is that Christianity is the only source of anti Semitism that's been repudiated. That is, the primary Christian leaders in the 20th century rejected anti Semitism and this understanding of Christianity. But it certainly has a long history, and many people suffered as a result. It's also contradictory to basic Christianity because the idea of Christianity is that the Jesus as the Savior is on the cross bearing the sins of the whole world, and the sins of the whole world are what put him on the cross. So that in a certain sense, everyone who sins is putting Jesus on the cross. So to say that, which all Christian groups would agree to, contradicts the idea that it's particularly the Jews' fault. If it is, then it's not the result of everyone's sins. But if it's the result of everyone's sins, then it's no more the fault of the Jews than of anyone else. And so Christian anti Semitism was ultimately fundamentally incoherent. And thus the Pope and the Ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople and others rejected it. In Islam, it has not been rejected. And as I explained before, it's very misunderstood in the West, and a lot of people don't know how deeply rooted it is. But the Quran tells the Muslims that the Jews are their worst enemies, that they will be always scheming against them, that they are accursed of Allah, that Allah changed them into apes and pigs for their disobedience, all these terrible things. And then there's much more in the Hadiths, the traditions about Muhammad, that Jewish woman poisoned him and killed him, that they tried to kill him on several other occasions, that the rabbis would knew that he was a prophet but lied deliberately about it because they're just inherently perverse and evil people. And this has to be understood. This is the prism through which the average, this is not esoteric stuff, the average Palestinian Arab sees the Israeli Palestinian conflict through this prism. And so they understand these people are barely human. They're deeply evil. They hate God. and they hate the people of God, and they're always scheming against us. That they're not going to live side by side in peace and harmony with such people. Even if we didn't have the theology I explained before about drive them out from where they drove you out, but that just compounds it all.
Is-
Then national,
I
yes,
just
sorry.
wanted to know, is the Quran is vehement against Christians?
Yes, but not so much. Uh, the Christians are cursed, and the Christians are called unbelievers if they believe in the divinity of Christ, the crucifixion, the resurrection, the redemption in Christ. All of that is rejected in the Quran. It's repeatedly said Allah doesn't have any son. There's no son of God. There's no uh, none of any of that is basic to Christian theology. There's no Trinity and so on. But it's noteworthy that in chapter 5, verse 82, the same verse that says that the most vehement in hostility toward the believers will be the Jews, it goes on to say that the closest in friendship to the believers will be the Christians.
That's
And
very interesting.
yeah, yeah. And so historically, they both have fit under the label, and this is also in, excuse me, in the Quran, the people of the book. Both the Jews and the Christians are people of the book. The people of the book are to be waged war against and subjugated under the rule of Islamic law. But the Jews are among the people of the book the worst.
So the
And
Quran doesn't call Christians pigs and monkeys.
no. And although they're actually, some of those passages do refer to the people of the book and not in particular to the Jews, but in context, since they're talking about Moses, talking about other prophets of the Jews, it does seem as if they're likely to be referring more to the Jews than to the Christians. Then the Hadith are much more directed against the Jews than the Christians. You have Muhammad saying that other animals like rats and so on are Jews transformed, as well as the apes and pigs. And he never says anything like that about the Christians. And the Jews, as I said, schemed to kill Muhammad. One of them poisoned Muhammad, and so on. And none of that, the Christians are not involved in any of that.
Okay. So that's the Christians' hatred and the particular hatred and the Islamic particular hatred. What about National Socialism and international socialism?
Yeah, National Socialism, of course, we thought was a dead ideology, and now here it is again. Uh, for example, I mean, of course, I should explain first that National Socialism is a racial idea, among other things, but one of the main things that it is the idea that the dividing line between good and evil, you could say, it runs between the Jews and everybody else. That you have the good race, the Aryans, the Germans, or the Europeans in a broader sense, and then you have the evil race. And so the two cannot come together, the two cannot live together, and thus the Jews had to be killed in National Socialist Germany. Now, we thought, like I said, we thought that was all done with, but nowadays, for example, Tucker Carlson, the very popular, very famous, very prominent spokesman on the right, has actually platformed a historian named Daryl Cooper who's been retailing talking points that actually were devised in National Socialist Germany about how, for example, there was no Holocaust. It was just that the German army advanced so quickly that it ran out of supplies and couldn't feed all the prisoners that it had taken in Russia after the beginning of the war again between Germany and Russia, Germany and the Soviet Union in 1941, and so on. And these things, the National Socialists actually said these things at the time, but nobody has been saying this kind of thing since then until now. And there is a tremendous resurgence online, on Twitter and elsewhere, of essentially National Socialist propaganda against the Jews as this inherently evil people who are scheming to destroy non-Jewish civilization. And some of this is rooted in old, ancient Christian anti-Semitic ideas, but a lot of it originates from National Socialism as well. And then the international socialists, a lot of people don't realize that anti-Semitism is just as strong in communism as it is in Nazism. For example, Karl Marx wrote a little known book that equated the Jews with the capitalists. And in his scheme of things, he also had the idea that there was a dividing line between the good people and the evil people, that you have the workers, the proletarians, and they're the good, and the capitalists who are evil. And he said he made a one-on-one 100% equation between Jews and capitalists and said the Jews say they worship God, but what they really worship is money, and they represent finance capital, and thus they have to give up all of the aspects of being Jewish, all of the particulars of the Jewish identity, which, as far as he was concerned, meant stop being capitalists to join the workers. So it was the same thing that in a different form as the National Socialists, that the Jews had to essentially be erased so that the good people could triumph.
And there
And
has been a lot of anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union.
yeah, there was because it's kind of ironic because, of course, as is well known, and the anti-Semites like to point it out, many of the early Bolsheviks were Jews, most notably Trotsky. But the claim that it was a Jewish movement founders on this from Marx and also on the fact that Stalin went through different phases, but toward the end of his life, he was working on a mass murder of the Jews under the guise of the doctors, that they were these capitalists who were wealthy physicians and they were all Jews. And so he was plotting to have them all killed. And if that had been carried out, it would have been, but he died. So that's the only thing that prevented it from happening. But had it been carried out, it would have rivaled the Nazi Holocaust in terms of millions of people being killed. But they would be killed as capitalists who were Jews in line with what Marx had written, and thus cleansing the land of the capitalist scourge.
The Anti-Defamation League is a big believer in anti-racist education as a solution for also for anti-Semitism. Rabbi Raphael Shore, who we had on the show a few episodes ago, believes in living as proud Jews with strong Jewish values as a remedy against Jew hatred. Do you see a way to effectively fight anti-Semitism?
Yes, and I think that Rabbi Shore has a very important point, but that the ADL is all wrong. The ADL, I have to say, they're more leftists than anything else these days. And thus, I think because of their incredible myopia about leftist anti-Semitism and their refusal to admit that there could be anybody that they should ally with who is not a leftist. For example, they have me on their extremist list, and I've written this book about anti-Semitism, another book, The Palestinian Delusion, that's a defense of Israel and the case for Israel against the claims of the Palestinians. And they act like I'm some kind of an anti-Semite. It's frankly defamatory. And so I certainly have no good word for the ADL. But the worst part of what the ADL is doing in this is that I think that they are misleading the Jewish community in the United States to think that the biggest source of anti-Semitism today is from the right. And there's no doubt that there is a resurgence of like I was saying a minute ago, the National Socialist claims and the idea of the some kind of racial purity and a racial dividing line and so on. No doubt about that. But the biggest source of anti-Semitism today comes from the left. And it's the left that has allied with the jihadis to create this toxic and dangerous situation for Jewish students and pro-Israel students on campuses nationwide. And the ADL does nothing about that. And not only that, but this is where Rabbi Shore is correct, I would say, that, and the ADL is completely lost. The remedy, it would seem to me, is to fight against the collective, whatever collectivism may be in the ascendancy. And so if it's leftist collectivism, that's what we're suffering under today, although they want to make it much worse. They haven't succeeded in putting it through entirely. But nonetheless, there's a tremendous influence of leftist collectivism in the culture all over the West. That's the problem. We have to stand for individual rights, for the rights of individual communities to maintain their distinct identity, to not submit to the standardization of everything, the collectivization of everything, the equity imperative from the left, and so on. And so that's fundamentally what would be called a conservative vision, that the individual has dignity without recourse to the collective, and that individual groups that are distinct can come together on the basis of shared values without giving up their distinct identities. This is real diversity, not the left's kind of diversity, which doesn't allow for any diversity of thought.
Right.
Everybody dressed different and all different colors of people, but they all say the same things. Um, that's not real diversity. And in any case, I think that's ultimately the remedy for anti-Semitism, because it comes from the collectivist imperative, whatever form it may take, that we have to make a coherent stance against collectivism itself without sacrificing the elements of a larger community that are necessary for the protection of all citizens and so on.
I think no, I think it's not a good thing that the ADL is fighting you. I also think that they do these days somewhat more admit that there is anti-Semitism coming from the left and also from Islamists. Um, but I still think that they believe that everything can be mainly solved by education, and they would not say stand for individual rights and individual freedom. I
They're out
think.
of touch also because they should talk to some teenagers. Uh, I found something very interesting in talking to teenagers, and that is that they are thoroughly sick of leftist indoctrination. Not all of them, obviously, but there are a great many, because teenagers are naturally contrary and rebellious, who take anti-racism education and education about whatever else that might be coming from their teachers, and they choose the opposite side. This is one of the reasons why there's a resurgence of the right anti-Semitism, because it's so strenuously taught against in the schools
Yeah,
that the students who rebel, they go that way.
yeah.
And so I would respectfully suggest that it has to be a different kind of approach, because this is just going to create a backlash from the rebellious.
What do you hope readers will get? If someone reads your book, what do you want them to be able to say afterwards, and what do you want them to be able to do?
And the book is titled Anti-Semitism, History and Myth.
There it is. Yeah, I hope that they will understand where anti-Semitism comes from, why it is recurring today, why it will always be with us in various forms, but how what genuine and effective ways to deal with it can be approached, as I just outlined. That once we understand where it really comes from, then we can deal with it more realistically. This is the problem, of course, also with Islamic Jihad. And so many governments have these de-radicalization programs. And it's just another example of how education doesn't always work. That they think that Islam is peaceful, and so they try to teach jihadis in prison the true peaceful Islam. But the true Islam is not peaceful, so the jihadis don't take it seriously, and the de-radicalization programs don't work. It's the same thing here. if we don't understand where the problem is really coming from, then we can't deal with it adequately. So I hope that the book explains where anti-Semitism comes from, how it's recurring today, and how to deal with it adequately.
Before we go to our last question, there's one follow-up question I have to what you just said. What about countries like Saudi Arabia and the Emirates that who are these days more friendly towards Israel and are also eliminating their education in their schools that is anti-Jewish? What about their Islam?
Well, I'm
Is
all
it
for that, but
is
it's
is it more friendly towards Jews?
yes, but it's not Islam. It's less Islam. It's diet Islam. It's Islam light. What they're doing is they are on the basis of pragmatic considerations. The fact that they all face a common threat in Shiite Iran, they are making common cause with Israel and thus toning down the anti Jewish aspects of their educational system and, one would hope, of the larger culture. Now, that's all to the good. I'm all for that, but we have to be realistic. As long as they continue to believe in Islam and teach Islam, there are going to be people who think that all that is wrong and be fighting against it within those countries. And if it comes to pass that it is no longer advantageous for them to be making common cause with Israel, for example, if the Islamic Republic of Iran falls and a friendly regime is put in place in Iran, then there's no more reason for Saudi Arabia and Israel to be together. And I would expect that whatever rapprochement has been achieved by then will break down because of the deep anti-Semitism that's in the Quran and Islamic tradition in general. There can never be a full accord or alliance between the state of Israel and any of these Islamic states.
Do you have advice for our listeners who want to do something against anti-Semitism?
Yes, you should do something against anti-Semitism. It's very important to be proactive, and I would suggest that one of the main things that can and should be done is to raise awareness about what the causes are, why these things are happening, how we see this tremendous crest of leftist anti-Semitism today, and where it is coming from and why, and encourage people to challenge leftists of their acquaintance to think about this, to think about the deep inhumanity of the line that their ideological kin are taking, and to reject it.
And I think reading your book is tremendously helpful in understanding anti-Semitism and being able to raise awareness about it. Um,
And being able to uh, address it calmly instead of with actual knowledge. So that's always important. As we Jews have learned, the people of the book. Anyway, Robert, I thank you so much for coming on. I really do think that this has been an enlightening episode. I think our listeners, those of you who would like to know more about Evelyn and myself and our other work, you can go to Never Again Is Now podcast at YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeart, right?
yep.
And as we end every episode, we say, please speak up against anti Semitism and all hate.